The room smelled like stale coffee and expensive cologne, the kind of combination that only exists in places where enormous amounts of money are on the line. It was the fall of 1991, somewhere deep inside a New York recording studio, and Clive Davis, the most powerful man in the American music industry, was watching the clock tick toward midnight and losing his patience fast. He had a problem, a beautiful, extraordinary, maddening problem named Whitney Houston. And that problem was refusing to cut 4 seconds of music. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of someone else's expectations, threatening to flatten everything you know to be true about yourself, subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in that studio that night is one of the greatest stories in music history, and almost nobody knows it. Clive Davis had signed Whitney Houston to Arista Records back in 1983, when she was barely 19 years old and still singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. He had watched her become the best-selling female artist of the 1980s. He had guided every single, every album rollout, every strategic move, every calculated risk. He had introduced her to the world, shaped her image, and positioned her as the crown jewel of his entire label. He had built the machine, and for nearly a decade, the machine had run perfectly. And now, with The Bodyguard's soundtrack shaping up to be the biggest commercial project of Whitney's career, a film, a record deal, and a marketing blitz that were all perfectly aligned, he needed everything to be exactly right. The centerpiece of that soundtrack was a Dolly Parton song from 1973 called I Will Always Love You. Clive had fought for that song. Producer David Foster had constructed an arrangement so lush and cinematic, it practically had its own gravitational field. The piano introduction alone could stop a room cold. And Whitney's vocal performance through the verses and the climbing choruses was everything any record executive could have dreamed of. Controlled, precise, emotionally devastating in all the right ways. But then there was the ending. And the ending is where Clive Davis slammed his hand on that table. To understand why, you have to understand what the music industry in 1991 believed about radio. Radio programmers were gods, and those gods had rules carved in stone. Songs that clocked in over 4.5 minutes faced significant resistance at top 40 stations. Tracks with unconventional endings, long instrumental codas, improvised passages, anything that felt unresolved or emotionally unpredictable, made music directors nervous and quick to reach for the next card. And gospel-style ad-libs, the kind of vocal improvisation Whitney had grown up doing in church, the kind where the singer essentially departs the written melody and starts having a direct, spontaneous conversation with the divine. Those were considered commercial poison in the crossover pop market. Clive Davis did not become Clive Davis by ignoring those rules. After the final session where Whitney laid down what she believed was the definitive take of I Will Always Love You, there was a brief silence in the control room. The kind of silence that feels like everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. Then Clive pulled the producer aside, and later that same evening, he sat down with Whitney's team and delivered his verdict with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had never in his professional life been wrong about what would sell. The ending needed to come off. The ad-libs had to go. It's too long, he said. Radio won't touch it with those runs at the end. We need a clean finish. What nobody outside that room knew, and what makes this story so much more than a business disagreement, is what was packed into those gospel runs at the end of that song. Whitney hadn't improvised them in the usual sense of the word. She had, in her own way, prayed them into existence. Every one of those elongated, spiraling, aching vocal flights at the end of I Will Always Love You carried something that no producer could have written and no arranger could have notated. They were the sound of a woman who had been molded and packaged and polished and sold for 8 straight years finally, in the last 30 seconds of a song, letting the church back in. And Clive Davis wanted to cut them. But here's what changed everything about that night. Here's the moment that turned a routine creative argument into something that would echo for 30 years. Whitney said no, not the way a temperamental artist says no, throwing a tantrum and storming out of the room. Whitney Houston said no, the way Sissy Houston's daughter says no, quietly, completely, with a kind of bedrock certainty that stopped the conversation cold. She looked at the people in that room, the executives and the producers, and the yes men who had spent the last decade telling her exactly what the audience wanted. And she told them something they were not accustomed to hearing. "That's the most honest part of the whole record," she said. "That's the only part that's actually me." Clive Davis was not a man who was easily moved. He had heard every argument, every emotional appeal, every artistic justification in the book. He had signed Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and Janis Joplin and Barry Manilow. He had navigated 40 years of artists telling him they knew better. He leaned back and asked her one question. The question he always asked when an artist dug in on something he believed was a mistake. "Do you trust me?" And Whitney Houston looked at the man who had made her career and told him the truth. "I trust you with everything except this." The silence that followed lasted a long time. Long enough for the tension in that room to become something you could feel in your chest. Long enough for David Foster to study the carpet. Long enough for the assistants near the door to stop breathing. And then Clive Davis, for one of the very few times in his professional life, backed down. Nobody in that room could have known what they were witnessing. Nobody could have predicted that the ad-libs Clive wanted to cut would become the most replicated vocal moment in the history of American popular music. Nobody could have known that in the decades following the release of the Bodyguard soundtrack, thousands of singers, from high school auditoriums to American Idol stages to professional concerts on 6 continents, would attempt to reproduce exactly what Whitney did in those final seconds. Nobody knew that those gospel runs would become the benchmark against which every female vocalist would eventually be measured. The standards so high that most would fail, the impossible target that defined greatness. All they knew in that room was that Whitney Houston had refused to cut something, and Clive Davis had let her keep it. The Bodyguard soundtrack was released in November of 1992. I Will Always Love You debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 14 consecutive weeks, a record that held for years. The album sold over 45 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling soundtrack in history. Radio stations that Clive had been certain would reject a long ending with gospel improvisations did not reject it. They played it in heavy rotation for 18 straight months. Program directors who had spent their careers enforcing the rules of commercial radio could not explain why a song that broke every one of those rules dominated every format it touched. But anyone who had ever sat in a church pew in Newark, New Jersey, could have told them exactly why. What Clive Davis heard as a liability, the rawness, the departure from the written melody, the unpolished spiritual urgency of those final vocal runs, was precisely what made the song inescapable. Pop music in 1992 was sleek and controlled and thoroughly produced. And then this voice came out of the radio at 3 in the afternoon and did something that was none of those things. It was honest in a way that felt almost reckless. It was human in a way that made every other song on the playlist sound like it had been assembled in a factory. Those ad-libs were not a commercial liability. They were the entire point. Whitney Houston had understood something about her own gift that her most powerful advocate could not see. There is a version of this story where Whitney cuts the ending, where she defers to the man who built her career, who had been right about everything else for 8 years, who controlled the most important record deal in the music business. In that version, I Will Always Love You is a very good song on a very successful soundtrack. It has a clean finish, radio plays it, people enjoy it, and then they move on. And nobody tries to replicate the ending because there is nothing in the ending to replicate. There is no standard. There is no impossible target. There is only a well-produced, commercially appropriate, completely forgettable conclusion to a beautiful song. That version doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is that a 28-year-old woman who grew up singing in a Newark gospel choir knew exactly where the line was between giving the industry what it needed and surrendering the last honest piece of herself. She held that line on a Tuesday night in 1991 while Clive Davis waited for her to blink. She didn't blink. David Foster, who witnessed that exchange, would say years later that he had never seen anything quite like it. He had worked with the biggest names in the music business, Barbra Streisand, Celine Dion, Michael Jackson, Had been in rooms where egos the size of stadiums collided over production decisions. That amounted to fractions of a second. But the way Whitney held her ground that night was different from anything he had encountered in 40 years of working with extraordinary talent. It wasn't ego. It wasn't stubbornness. It was conviction so deep and so quiet that it was almost frightening. She wasn't fighting for a note, Foster recalled. She was fighting for something that didn't have a name. What it had, though it didn't have a name in that room, was a sound. And that sound, those final, climbing, gospel-drenched runs at the end of a Dolly Parton country song, became the most defining vocal statement of the entire decade. Clive Davis, to his considerable credit, understood what had happened. He was gracious about it afterward, and gracious about it for the rest of his life. He was not wrong to raise the concern. He was, in fact, doing exactly what he had always done, which was protect an artist from decisions he believed would cost her commercially. He had been right enough times that his instincts had earned the right to be heard. He was simply, on this particular evening, wrong. And the thing that made him wrong was the same thing that had made him right about Whitney Houston in 1983. He could hear what an audience wanted, but on this night, only Whitney could hear what this specific song needed. She knew it needed her, not the polished version, not the radio-friendly version, not the version that fit neatly inside the commercial constraints of 1991. It needed the girl from New Hope Baptist Church, the one who had been singing to God before she was ever singing to a crowd. It needed the voice that Sissy Houston had listened to from across the choir loft and recognized as something that could not be manufactured or improved or controlled. It needed the ad-libs. And 30 years later, every time someone stands on a stage anywhere on earth and reaches for those final notes, every time a young singer closes their eyes and tries to find the place where Whitney went in those last seconds, they are reaching for something that almost didn't exist. They are reaching for the notes that a record executive told her to cut, that she refused to cut, that she protected in a room full of people who thought they knew better. She was right. They were wrong. And those 4 seconds changed everything. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations? The pressure to be smaller, cleaner, more manageable than who you actually are, only to hold the line and let your true gift speak for itself? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if this moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.